Picture this crowded dance floor shaking the room with strobe lights cutting through it. Last night's event at Atlanta's biggest nightclub wasn't just a party. It was a battleground of emotions, trauma, and unadulterated tension. The atmosphere was at an all-time high, the audience was drinking, and the city's elite were mixing. But Kirk Frost and Young Jock intervened not just at a party, but with it began with slow, chilly stares, hushed talks, and a storm gathering as they had something important on their minds and their target. Lil Scrappy, a man whose magnetic presence could light up any room. Below the surface, everything exploded. The atmosphere changed abruptly. The words became abrasive, and the dance floor center abruptly turned into a battlefield. Phones began to record. This wasn't just a heated argument. It was a full-fledged face-off that had the entire club on edge. But what made Kirk and Jock confront Scrappy? Every second, others froze too stunted to react. Although the night had only just began, the vibe inside that Atlanta nightclub was already electric, the kind of night that people would want to experience. And how far did it go before security had to intervene? Talk about weeks of loud music, bright lights, and an ever-increasing throng. The line outside Wilder stretched around the block and was made up of the most fashionable and connected people in the city. The dance floor was alive with strobe lights that flared and sank with the pounding bass, giving glimpses of people engrossed in the music. If you were a person with status, this was the place to be. Everywhere you looked, people were in their zone as the bar groups crowded over cocktails and shouted to be heard over the loud music. But the atmosphere wasn't the same up in the VIP area. Kirk Frost and Young Jock were sitting at their own booths with entourages buzzing around them, and it was about a celebration that was happening beneath the surface. Kirk's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and Jock's laughter felt forced and delayed. There was a tension between them, even if the part designer wore expensive liquor and exuded success. People in their immediate vicinity either didn't notice them or didn't care because they were too preoccupied with the benefits of being in the orbit of two well-known figures across the room. They were invisible to most, yet impossible to ignore. When Kirk and Jock were absorbed in their thoughts in another VIP booth, Lil Scrappy was the life of the party. His laughter broke the music, his movements were fluid, and he was pure energy. Unquestionably charismatic, Scrappy commanded the place. People swarmed toward him, glasses clinked, and someone would drop by every few minutes to pay their respects. Kind of man who made a routine night into something special, and tonight was no exception. But beneath the surface, things were changing. Kirk and Jack kept glancing subtly toward Scrappy's booth. Initially, there was a glance here and a whispered conversation there, but as the minutes went by, it became evident that Kirk leaned in and spoke in a low, frantic voice, and Jock's expression darkened whatever they were discussing. A waitress bringing drinks hesitated, noticing the difference, and her eyes darted between Kirk's tense jaw and Jock's narrowed stare. It wasn't simply casual chat. Before swiftly continuing, the atmosphere at Scrappy's table remained electrifying and unfazed. He proceeded toward the dance floor, pausing to say hello to a few people he knew and lifting his glass in Jack tightened as he moved closer to Kirk. "You see what I'm seeing?" he said over the hammering, acknowledging that if he felt the weight of their stares, he didn't show it. Bass Kirk took a while to respond, his gaze fixed on Scrappy's every action, and then he nodded. "Yes," he replied in a measured voice. "I see history here, one of the most in the club." Weren't aware that the three guys had been friends for years, attending the same events and hanging out in the same circles. Their interactions appeared amicable to outsiders, but behind the scenes, Scrappy's ascent, his unbridled self-assurance, and his expanding impact had made him a darling of many, but not of everyone. For Kirk and Jockey, it wasn't just about him. It was about what he stood for, his unwavering self-assurance, his capacity to attract attention, and the way he moved as if nothing could affect him, all of which made a message that some people didn't like. The club's intensity peaked as the DJ changed tracks, the dance floor erupted, the lights flashed faster, bodies moved tighter, and Kirk and Jock stood up. Their movements were purposeful. Without saying a word, They started to push past the crowd, heading directly towards Scrappy, who was engrossed in the scene. He raised his glass, bowed to fans shouting his name, and maintained the energy, but many around him noticed it coming as the environment altered. And then, all of a sudden, everything was different. By the time Scrappy looked up, it was too late. The music, the flashing lights, the distant laughter, and the air surrounding them changed when Kirk stopped a few steps away and tucked his pockets in as the jock moved closer. A dense stillness enveloped their tense area in the background, and Scrappy lowered his drink a little, his typical smile fading, and straightened his stance as he assessed them. His tone was casual but careful as he inquired, "What's going on, guys?" Behind him, his crew stirred, and a few of them rose up, their eyes darting between Kirk and the jock. No one spoke, but the tension in the room was unavoidable, and even the people who were watching them saw it. Kirk took a while to respond, studying Scrappy with an unreadable expression, and then at last "You've been running your..." Scrappy's hand tightened around his drink as Kirk's mouth murmured, voice low, even stirring up drama. He cocked an eyebrow, but his voice still had the same assurance as usual. Wavering, "I don't know what you mean." He spoke firmly, but his body language betrayed him. His eyes darted to his booth, where his staff was now completely awake, and they spoke among themselves. But nobody moved. Scrappy knew that this was his battle, and if you had anything to say, you should say it. He turned back to them, and the jock pushed forward to close the remaining distance. His body language was composed and controlled, but his eyes conveyed a different message. "We have a lot to say," Jock remarked, his voice cutting through the background commotion. "If you're smart, you'll listen." Scrappy didn't flinch. On the contrary, his posture hardened. "Oh, I see." His tone veered toward defiance, and he took a step forward, now standing, with his free hand curled into a fist by his side. The audience surrounding them moved when they were almost knee-to-toe with the jock. Some took a step back, while others leaned in, enticed by the promise of an explosion. At that point, the nightclub wasn't about the music. The area where Kirk Frost, Young Jock, and Lil Scrappy stood had changed into a whole new battlefield close to Scrappy's crew, and it wasn't about the drinks or the party. There were nervous people standing and hanging close to the booth, with eyes darting between the three men and rapid, hurried whispers. No one wanted to initiate contact, but everyone could sense what was Jack was the first to speak, and you understand what he was saying when he pointed the finger at Scrappy. "You've been lying for so long that you believe you can get away with it." Scrappy raised his chin and his jack tightened, saying, "If I have something to say, I'll say it." He shot back, "But don't approach me with baseless charges unless you..." Kirk walked up with a chilly expression, saying, "We've got more than just words, Scrappy." He said, "We've got receipts." With a swift swipe, he unlocked his phone and held up the screen, and Scrappy's face reflected the device's glare. He squinted to attempt to see the details, but the weight of Kirk's gesture conveyed everything Scrappy needed to know. His jaw tightened, so he added, "You're going to show me some out-of-context messages, that's your proof." He sneered and waved a dismissive hand, but his stance had shifted somewhat. "Lily," a change that only occurs when someone begins to feel the walls, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. His swagger was still there. Jock made another step to close in, and was now standing shoulder to shoulder with Kirk. This isn't out of context, but Jock's voice was lower now and more harsh. He was being serious. He leaned in and said, "It's time to own up before this gets worse." Scrappy's annoyance boiled over, and he squared his shoulders, planted his feet, and locked his voice broke through the din louder. "Look at the two men. Do you think you can come in here and press me? Now, who do you think you are?" Heads moved from surrounding tables. Discussions quieted. The pulse of the nightclub continued to beat, the bass continued to thud, and the lights continued to flash. But in this little area, all attention was on them as a small group of people gathered at the boundaries, drawn in by the fire. Kirk moved in slightly, and you kept running your mouth between them. He didn't blink, and his voice was precise and controlled, but below there was steel that was larger than you might imagine. Before continuing to push your luck, consider that it will affect not just you, but also everyone around you. The words hit hard, and Scrappy took a slow, deep breath and balled his fists. His shoulders were clenched at his sides, and he snarled, "If you have anything to say it now because I'm done playing games." In a low, but their presence was enough to create a loose semicircle behind him, a wall of silent support. The jock laughed and shook his head, saying, "You said too much already." Kirk abruptly moved forward till Scrappy could feel the heat of his breath, and then he stated, "We're just here to make sure you know we're not letting it slide." Nearly drowned out by the music, but still able to cut through the tension, Kirk whispered, "Keep talking, and you'll see what happens next." Scrappy remained motionless and didn't blink his heart. Jock's fists tightened, Kirk's eyes narrowed, and Scrappy's crew pushed closer as the room's vibe changed once more. He hammered, but his voice was firm, saying, "You don't scare me." The audience was on the verge of exploding as their muscles tensed up for whatever was about to happen, but a hard hand broke the tension and landed on Kirk's shoulder. "That's enough." A security guard with a large, calm, authoritative voice said, "Take it outside or take a seat." At first, Kirk remained motionless, his gaze fixed on Scrappy. Though his posture remained rigid, the unflappable jock rolled his shoulders and took a step back. Scrappy exhaled slowly, releasing his stance, but the fire in his eyes never went out. The security guard wasn't for a brief moment. It appeared as though Kirk and Jock may push back the air as he gestured toward their booths and said, "I don't care who you are." He continued, "Vote like stone, this isn't the place for that," full of the weight of everything that was left unsaid. But Kirk put his phone back in his pocket and murmured, "We'll work this out another time." His voice was low enough for Scrappy to hear Jack give. Scrappy gave it one final glance before turning away. They strolled back toward their VIP area, vanishing into the crowd. Scrappy didn't move correctly. There were no more threats or words, only implicit vows. Away, his palms were still buzzing from the adrenaline, and his breath was still a little heavy. One of his crew members touched his shoulder, and Scrappy blinked, forcing himself to ease back into he picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and turned to face his booth. His voice was steady and calm, but there was a hint of tension below it as they all spoke. He allowed the words to settle. But when he sat down, that gut instinct wouldn't go away. The way Kirk and Jock had approached him and looked at him wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The tension persisted throughout the night, thickening and settling into the air like smoke that would not go away. Kirk and Jock returned to their booth, but the atmosphere had changed. Drinks remained unfinished, and there was no discussion. The two men were no longer just having fun. Instead, they were observing and planning their next move across the club. Despite Scrappy's best efforts to hide it, his group remained close and their talks were kept quiet as he leaned back in his booth with a drink in hand and a sneer on his lips. Every few minutes, the entire club fell apart like a storm waiting to burst out, their gazes darting toward Kirk and Jockey. Then, the whisper began. What had been a private standoff became well known in record time, and people whispered about what they had witnessed, embellishing every detail like storytellers creating a fable about a woman leaning close to her near the bar. A man at the opposite end of the room chuckled as he narrated his version of events, while her buddy spoke in a quiet but anxious manner. I believe Kirk and Juke were about to set it off with this near to swinging. Even though no fists had been thrown, the rumors took on a life of their own, and when the phones rang and a shaky video appeared, Scrappy stood them down like a champion. The moment's weight was heavy in the air as Kirk and the Jock stood in front of Scrappy in a little video clip taken from across the room that was posted on social media. The club staff tried their best to keep the evening going, but they understood that this wasn't just another celebrity feud their club had, and within minutes the hashtag began trending. Kirk checked his phone after being the subject of a viral moment back in VIP. His jaw was clenched as he read through the influx of comments, saying, "They're talking like we're the bad guys." As we began, the doctor looked at the screen and shook his head, saying, "It's just noise. But after a moment, perhaps it was time to set the low control, but tight with frustration, Kirk nodded, but his eyes remained unsoftened. "Yes," he said, putting his phone in his pocket. "We need to handle this." Meanwhile, Scrappy's team was observing the scene across the club. One of his boys turned his phone toward him and smiled as the same firestorm played on their screens. They called him the king of the club and said, "You're a legend, man." Scrappy chuckled briefly, but it was without humor. His fingers tapping his glass and his eyes darting to Kirk and Jock's booth. "Yeah," he whispered, "but we all know they're not when this was finished." He took a slow sip of his drink without looking away. They were sitting there making plans. He put the glass down and clinked quietly. "You think this is over?" He sighed, shaking his head. "No, they are only getting started." As the club closed, the atmosphere outside was equally as heated as it had been inside, and people continued to linger in the parking lot, exchanging stories and speculating about what had begun as a fight and had now developed into a full-fledged saga. It was more than simply a night out. It was a story that had the entire city talking. When Kirk and Jock eventually got up, they hadn't took another drink and didn't need to say anything because their relationship was full of unspoken plans. Kirk looked toward the exit and said, "Let's go," without hesitation. The Jock followed without turning around or saying anything. Scrappy watched them go, his mouth clenched, thinking they were simply going to go and come at me another day. They had just made a silent vow that this wasn't the end. One of his boys leaned in and whispered, but Scrappy shook his head and kept his eyes fixed on the door. "No," he muttered, "this ain't over outside the night air was." It was cool, but there was still a lot of tension. A group of people had gathered close to the valet, reading through their phones and arguing.